The wind howled through the pines, a relentless force sweeping across the Montana wilderness. Snow lashed against the trees, thick and blinding, erasing all traces of the trail beneath its frozen grip. Eleanor Whitmore stumbled forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, each one a desperate attempt to push back the searing cold clawing at her lungs. Blood dripped from the gash above her temple, warm against her skin before the bitter wind turned it to ice. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her once pristine traveling dress now torn, soaked, and heavy with frost. The storm had stolen all sense of direction, leaving only a vast and unforgiving white stretching in every direction. Panic clawed at her chest. She should be dead. The outlaws had left her for dead. The stagecoach was gone. The others gone. She forced herself not to think of them, of the gunfire, the screams, the flash of steel in the moonlight before everything became a blur of hooves and terror. The moment she had broken free and fled into the dark had been pure instinct. Now, she wondered if death would still claim her, just slower, crueler. Her foot caught on an unseen root beneath the snow, sending her tumbling forward. The impact rattled through her bones, and she barely had the strength to push herself up. Darkness edged her vision, urging her to let go, to sleep. Then, through the chaos of the storm, she saw it. A light, faint flickering, a lantern swaying behind a frosted window. She forced herself forward, crawling when her legs refused to carry her. The cabin loomed ahead, sturdy and dark against the swirling white. She reached the door with the last of her strength and pounded against the wood before her arms gave out. The world tilted. Cold seeped through her bones, and as her vision blurred, she heard the heavy creak of the door swinging open. The first thing she felt was warmth, a sharp contrast to the brutal cold that had seeped into her marrow. It wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The scent of burning would fill her nose, mingling with something else, earthy, rugged, smoke and pine, and something unmistakably masculine. Her eyelids fluttered open. The dim glow of a fire flickered across wooden walls, casting long shadows over the sparse cabin. Rough-hewn furniture, a rifle propped against the wall, and a single chair by the fire, all signs of a life lived in solitude. Then she saw him. A man stood near the fire, his back turned, broad shoulders framed in the thick furs draped over him. He moved with practiced efficiency, stirring something in a pot over the flames. His hair was dark, long enough to brush the nape of his neck, but it was the way he carried himself that unsettled her. Still, silent, dangerous. She pushed herself up on her elbows, and the movement sent a wave of pain crashing through her skull. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The man turned. His eyes, gray like river stone, locked onto hers. He said nothing at first, merely studied her with the patience of a predator who had all the time in the world. His face was angular, weathered, the kind carved by hardship rather than time. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady. "Where am I?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched by the fire, scooped something from the pot into a wooden bowl, and set it on the small table beside her. "My cabin," he finally said. His voice was low, rough, as if it had been in use for too long. Eleanor clenched her fist beneath the blanket. Who are you?" He didn't offer a name, only nodded toward the bowl. "Eat." She stared at him. "I'm not." "You will be," he interrupted. "Eat." His gaze was unreadable, but there was no threat in it. No kindness, either. He had saved her, but not out of pity. That much was clear. Her hands trembled as she reached for the spoon, muscles still stiff with cold. The stew was thick, barely seasoned, but the warmth spread through her, reviving something deep inside. She forced herself to focus. "I need to get back to town," she said, glancing toward the door. There was an attack. The stagecoach. It was... "I know," he said, cutting her off again. She stiffened. "You know, found the wreck 2 nights back." He leaned against the table, arms crossed. No survivors. The words hit her like a physical blow. No survivors. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed left a hollow ache in her chest. She set the spoon down carefully, struggling to control her breathing. And the outlaws? Gone. A pause. For now. She shivered, not entirely from the cold. If they were still out there, she wasn't safe. Her gaze darted toward the rifle by the door. I need to leave. The man exhaled, slow, deliberate. Storm says otherwise. I don't care about the storm, she snapped, throwing the blanket off. I have to. The moment her feet hit the floor, they buckled. Pain shot through her skull, and before she could collapse, strong arms caught her. For a brief moment, she was aware of how solid he was, how effortlessly he held her up. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped her just firmly enough to stop her from falling. Sit, he ordered, guiding her back onto the bed. She glared up at him, breath unsteady. You can't keep me here. I ain't keeping you anywhere, he said evenly. But if you step outside now, you'll be dead before you reach the Treeline. She hated that he was right. The storm still howled outside, thick as ever. Her hands curled into fists. And what am I supposed to do? Just wait. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked back to the fire, his movements deliberate. You want to leave, he said at last. Fine, but you won't last an hour out there. His gaze met hers across the cabin, unreadable. So if you're set on dying, you let me know. I won't stop you. Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. The storm raged. Eleanor sat, jaw tight, frustration burning in her chest. She was trapped with a man who spoke as little as possible and seemed utterly indifferent to whether she lived or died. But something told her that wasn't entirely true. He had saved her. He had brought her here. He had given her food, warmth. That meant something, even if she didn't understand it yet. The storm had passed, but the silence it left in its wake was heavy. Eleanor sat by the cabin's only window, staring out at the untouched white stretching beyond the tree line. Sunlight gleamed off the snow, deceptively peaceful. But the world outside felt different now, unsettled, as if something unseen lurked just beyond sight. She had been here for 3 days. 3 long, tense days in which her only company had been the man who saved her. He was still a stranger to her in every way that mattered. He spoke little, answered questions with silence or a single word, and moved through his space like a ghost, always watching but never lingering. She knew his name now. Sam. She had pried it from him the night before, though it had taken more effort than it should have. It suited him. Simple, unadorned, a man who had stripped himself of anything unnecessary, even his own past. He had made it clear she could leave when she was strong enough, but each time she tested the limits of her endurance. The weakness in her limbs betrayed her. The fever from her wound had broken, but exhaustion lingered, dragging at her bones. She wasn't ready. Not yet. A sound in the distance made her sit up straighter. Hoofbeats, faint but growing louder. She turned to Sam, but he was already moving, reaching for his rifle by the door. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture had changed, tense, wary. She stood too quickly, gripping the chair for balance. Who is it? He didn't answer. Instead, he unlatched the door, stepping onto the porch as the riders emerged from the tree line. 4 men, Eleanor's breath caught, at their head. Dressed in a fine wool coat and sitting atop a chestnut stallion was William Harper, her fiancé. She had not seen him in months, not since leaving Boston for her father's affairs in the West. She had known he would come for her. He had promised as much in his last letter. But seeing him now here sent a strange chill through her. His blue eyes swept over the cabin before settling on her, his expression shifting from shock to something sharper. Eleanor, his voice was smooth, practiced, a voice that had won over rooms full of men, charmed her father, and assured her of a secure future. She took a breath. William. He dismounted in one graceful motion, barely sparing Sam a glance before striding toward her. The moment he reached her, his hands were on her arms, his touch firm, possessive. "God above! I thought you were dead." His eyes flicked to her torn dress, the bandage at her temple, the exhaustion still clinging to her. Then, past her, to Sam, who stood by the door, rifle at his side, unreadable as ever. William's grip tightened. What happened? Her throat was dry. The stagecoach. Bandits. She hesitated. "I was the only one who made it out." His jaw clenched. "And you've been here." With him. It wasn't a question. The other men, townsmen, judging by their coats, shifted uneasily, watching Sam as if he were something wild that might attack if provoked. Sam said nothing. He merely met William's gaze, expression impassive. William turned back to Eleanor. "We're leaving. Now." Something in her bristled. She had waited for this moment, prayed for it when she had been lost in the storm. But now that he was here, something about the way he spoke unsettled her. She glanced at Sam. He had not moved, had not spoken. He simply watched. She took a step back. William's fingers dug into her wrist. "Eleanor," his voice lowered, careful, coaxing. "You've been alone with a man in the wilderness for 3 days. Do you know what that means?" The words landed like a stone in her stomach. She wrenched her hand free. "I had no choice." "It doesn't matter," he said sharply. "The town will talk. Your father," he exhaled, composing himself. "Eleanor, your reputation is already at risk. If we don't act quickly, it will be ruined." Ruin. The word carried weight, heavy and unyielding. She knew what it meant. The whispered gossip, the glances behind fans, the doors that would close to her, the life she had known, shattered. William turned to the preacher among the writers. "The solution is simple." Eleanor's heart pounded. "No." William ignored her. "They'll be married before sundown." The words hit her like ice. She spun toward Sam, expecting what? Protest? Defiance? Anything? He was still. No anger. No surprise. No refusal. Something cracked inside her. "Sam," she said, voice thin with disbelief. "Say something." His gaze met hers, unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned to William. "You're forcing her." William lifted his chin. "I'm saving her." The others murmured their agreement. This was the way of things. A woman compromised was a woman lost. There was no other choice. Eleanor's breath shook. "I won't." William caught her wrist again, softer this time but firm. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said, voice coaxing. "But what matters now is your future. Your father would agree. This is the only way." The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She looked at Sam one last time, searching for something, anything, but he said nothing. And just like that, it was done. The cabin had never felt so small. Eleanor sat by the fire, hands curled in her lap, the simple silver band on her finger feeling heavier than steel. The ceremony had been quick. A few murmured vows, a signature in the town's record, and it was finished. There had been no celebration, no joy, only necessity. Now, she was alone with him, her husband. The word tasted foreign wrong. She turned, watching him as he set his rifle against the wall. He had not spoken since they returned, had barely even looked at her. Anger swelled inside her. Is that it? He didn't turn. She shot to her feet. "You let them force this on me." You stood there and said nothing. Still, he said nothing. She took a step closer, voice rising. "You could have refused. You could have fought." At that, he finally turned. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was quiet. And what would that have changed? Her breath caught. He shook his head. "If I refused, they'd have shot me and taken you anyway. If I fought, they'd have called me a savage and strung me up." His jaw tightened. "You think you had no choice?" Neither did I. Silence stretched between them, thick with things left unsaid. She hated him for being right, hated that, in the end, this had never been about what either of them wanted. Her fingers curled into fists. I don't belong here. His gaze darkened. Then leave. The words hit like a slap. Her breath shook. Is that what you want? He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned back to the fire. I don't want anything, he murmured. The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat, turning away. She had thought the storm outside was the worst thing she had ever faced. But this was colder, and there was no escaping it. The wind had changed. Sam felt it before he saw the first tracks in the snow, deep, deliberate prints leading toward the cabin from the north. Not his. Not Eleanor's. Someone had been watching. His grip tightened around the rifle as he crouched near the tree line, scanning the ridge. The forest held its breath, silent in a way that set his instincts on edge. This was not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of something waiting to strike. He rose slowly, stepping back toward the cabin. Eleanor was by the fire when he entered, her delicate fingers working a torn seam in her sleeve. She didn't look up. She hadn't spoken much in the days since their forced union, but silence had become its own kind of conversation between them. He wasn't sure if she hated him, resented him, or simply didn't know what to do with him. It didn't matter. Right now, there were more pressing concerns. We're being watched. She looked up sharply, the needle slipping from her fingers. What? He set the rifle down and pulled on his coat. Tracks outside. Someone's close. Her face paled. The outlaws. It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. Could be. She swallowed hard, rising to her feet. Then we have to leave. Sam shook his head. Too late for that. Her lips parted in protest, but he was already moving, reaching for the revolver tucked behind his belt and loading it with practiced ease. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. What do we do? He met her gaze. We wait. The first shot came at dusk. A bullet shattered the cabin's window, spraying shards of glass across the floor. Eleanor gasped, ducking behind the table as Sam moved without hesitation, dragging her toward the farthest corner. Stay down, he ordered, pressing his back against the wall, rifle in hand. Outside, the snow muffled footsteps, but he counted at least 3 distinct movements. More than that, though, he felt them. The weight of unseen eyes tracking every breath. A familiar voice cut through the cold. Sam Holloway. Eleanor's head snapped toward him. They know you? Sam's jaw tightened. He did not answer. The voice called out again, mocking. You always were good at hiding. But we both know you can't hide forever. Recognition settled in his chest like a stone. He knew that voice. Jonas Reed. A killer, a thief, and a man with enough blood on his hands to stain the whole damn frontier. Eleanor's breath came fast. Why are they after you? Sam ignored the question. Stay here. She caught his wrist before he could stand. Are you insane? She hissed. They'll kill you. His fingers curled around hers for just a moment, warm, steady grounding. Then he gently pulled away. I've faced worse. Before she could protest, he was gone. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch, rifle at his shoulder. Jonas stood just beyond the tree-line, a smirk tugging at his scarred mouth. 2 men flanked him, their rifles at the ready. Thought you were dead, Jonas mused. Then I hear whispers of a man holed up in the mountains, keeping a fine lady all to himself. His gaze flicked to the cabin, a slow grin spreading across his face. Didn't take you for the marrying kind, Holloway. Sam didn't react. You got business with me, say it. Jonas chuckled. Oh, I think you know. He took a step forward. You still owe me for last time. Sam's grip on his rifle didn't waver. Last time, I let you live. Jonas grinned wider. And that was a mistake. The world hung still for the briefest second. Then Jonas moved. Sam fired first. The shot ripped through the cold, and Jonas dove behind a tree. The two others returned fire, splintering the wood of the porch railing. Sam rolled, taking cover against the cabin's outer wall. Inside, he heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. "Stay down," he barked. She didn't listen. A shadow moved near the side of the cabin, and before he could react, Eleanor flung open the door, his spare revolver clutched in her shaking hands. A shot rang out. One of the men staggered back, clutching his leg with a cry. Jonas cursed. "You've got some fight in you, lady." Eleanor's hands trembled, but her grip didn't falter. "Try me." Sam nearly smiled. Jonas exhaled sharply. "This ain't over, Holloway." With a final glare, he turned, his wounded man limping behind him. The other followed, glancing back once before disappearing into the trees. The silence that followed felt deafening. Eleanor's breath came fast, the gun still clutched in her hands. Sam stepped forward, carefully prying it from her fingers. She looked up at him, eyes wide. "They'll come back." He nodded. "Yeah." Her voice wavered. "What do we do now?" His fingers brushed hers just briefly. A quiet reassurance. "We survive. The night was long." Sam sat by the door, rifle in his lap, listening for any sign of movement beyond the trees. Eleanor stayed close, her presence a quiet weight in the dim firelight. She broke the silence first. "They knew you." Sam didn't answer right away. After a moment, he said, "Used to ride with them." Her breath hitched. "It was a long time ago." He exhaled, the past sitting heavy on his shoulders. "I walked away. They didn't like that." She studied him, searching for something in his face. "Why did you leave?" Sam met her gaze. "Because I got tired of running." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, "I know the feeling." Something passed between them then, unspoken but understood. The fire crackled, casting shadows against the walls. Sam leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. He felt her shift closer, the space between them growing smaller. Neither of them said anything, but for the first time since this all began, the silence no longer felt like a burden. The fire had burned low, the last embers pulsing weakly in the hearth. The air in the cabin was still, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Sam sat by the door, rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the window, watching for movement beyond the tree line. The night stretched long and restless, the promise of danger pressing against the walls like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor lay on the cot, her back turned to him, but he knew she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too careful, too measured. The tension between them had changed, shifting from resentment to something heavier, something neither of them knew how to name. She spoke without turning. "They won't stop, will they?" Sam exhaled slowly. "No." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "And you won't run." He shook his head, though she couldn't see it. "Not anymore." A long silence passed before she turned to face him. Her golden hair spilled over her shoulder, catching the dim light of the fire. Her eyes were sharp, searching his face for something. "Then what happens now?" Sam looked away. He had been asking himself the same question. The first sign of their return was the caw of a crow at dawn, breaking the fragile quiet of the morning. Sam was already on his feet, loading his rifle with steady hands. Eleanor sat up, her movements tense. "They're here," he murmured. She swallowed hard, rising from the cot. "Then we fight." Sam glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. She was different now. Not the woman he had pulled from the snow, nor the one who had trembled at the thought of a gun in her hands. There was steel in her now, forged in fire and hardship. He handed her his spare revolver. "Stay close." Outside, the world was quiet, too quiet. Then, a crack of a branch, the crunch of boots in the snow. Jonas Reed stepped out of the trees. He was alone this time, but Sam knew better than to believe that. The others would be watching, waiting. Jonas tilted his head. You knew I'd come. Sam's grip tightened on his rifle. Figured you couldn't take a loss. Jonas grinned, but there was no humor in it. You're a dead man, Holloway. And that pretty little wife of yours, well, I'll make sure she's taken care of. Eleanor stiffened beside him, but Sam didn't react. He had spent too many years knowing men like Jonas to rise to their bait. Instead, he raised the rifle. Jonas moved first. A gunshot split the morning air, followed by another. Sam barely had time to shove Eleanor behind him before diving for cover. The bullet missed him by inches, splintering the cabin's doorframe. Eleanor fired blindly toward the trees, her hands shaking but her aim steady. A cry of pain echoed through the woods. She had hit someone. Sam took the opening, rising to fire a single, measured shot. Jonas jerked backward, eyes wide with shock as a crimson bloom spread across his chest. He staggered, breath hitching. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees in the snow. His lips curled in something that might have been a smirk. "Damn," he rasped. "Didn't think you had it in you." Then he fell, still and silent. The forest held its breath. Then, rustling, the sound of retreating footsteps. The others had seen their leader fall. They wouldn't stay to fight a battle already lost. The threat was over. But Sam knew that peace, real peace, would never last. Eleanor's hands were still shaking when they stepped back inside. The revolver slipped from her grip, landing with a dull thud against the wooden floor. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Is it over?" Sam met her gaze. "For now," she swallowed, nodding slowly. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a short, breathless sound, half disbelief, half relief. He raised an eyebrow. She shook her head, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I just realized I don't even know if you're a good man." His lips twitched. "Does it matter?" Her eyes softened. "It should." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she asked, "What happens now?" Sam hesitated. He had been asking himself the same question. "You could leave," he said finally. "Go back to town, to your old life." Eleanor exhaled, considering. "And you?" He shrugged. "I'll be here." Something flickered across her face, an emotion too complex to name. "That's not much of a life." His jaw tightened. "It's the only one I know." Silence stretched between them again, heavier this time. Then, softly, "Come with me." Sam froze. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Come with me," she repeated. "We don't have to stay here. We don't have to be trapped by what we were." He wanted to. God! He wanted to. But the past wasn't so easily left behind. His hand came up, brushing against her cheek, lingering for just a moment longer than it should have. Then he pulled away. Her breath hitched. "Sam," he shook his head, "you deserve more than this." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she nodded once, as if accepting some unspoken truth. Then she turned, stepping toward the door. She hesitated only once, glancing back at him. "Goodbye, Sam." His throat tightened. He didn't say the words, but she heard them anyway. And then she was gone. The cabin felt colder without her in it. Sam stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, knowing that she had left something behind. A choice, a chance. And for the first time in a long, long time, Sam Holloway wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong.